Please, just make it quick," said the little girl, while waiting for the rancher to rescue. The sun was setting low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dry, cracked earth of the desert. The air, still hot from the day's heat, seemed to shimmer with the heat waves rising off the ground. For most people it was the end of another long day, a time to relax, unwind, and enjoy the peace that only a desert night could bring. But for little Clara, the night was just beginning, and the calm of the desert was shattered by the roar of a sudden storm.
It started as a small, gray cloud on the horizon.
But in the harsh desert, storms were unpredictable. The wind began to pick up speed, howling through the empty expanse of land, swirling the dust into the air. The sky darkened quickly, and the first raindrops fell, small at first, like an unexpected shower. But within minutes, the sky opened up, and rain began to pour down in torrents. Clara's heart began to race as she watched the sky change so suddenly. She had heard her mother and father talk about the unpredictability of the desert storms, but she had never experienced one like this. The rains were coming down so hard now that she could barely see the horizon. The little house that stood at the edge of the small farm where she lived with her parents was already beginning to flood. The dirt roads that were dry just hours ago were now rivers, rushing with water, taking anything in their path. Clara's father had always warned her about the dangers of these storms, but she had never taken them seriously. She always thought of the desert as a quiet, peaceful place, where nothing could really hurt them. But now the reality of the storm was crashing down on her. The floodwaters, moving fast and forceful, began to sweep across the farm, washing away the crops her father had worked so hard to grow. Clara's mother grabbed her by the hand, pulling her toward the house, as the wind howled outside. The sound of the rain pounding on the roof was deafening. "Stay close to me, Clara," her mother called, her voice almost drowned out by the storm. But even as Clara clung to her mother's side, she could feel the ground beneath them shaking as the floodwaters rose higher. Her heart was pounding now, her fear growing with every passing second.
Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the house.
The walls groaned and shuddered as the flood waters pushed against them with brutal force. Clara's mother froze, her face pale as she turned to her husband. "The house won't hold much longer," her father said, his voice filled with a mix of worry and urgency. "We have to get out of here. Now!" Without another word, Clara's father grabbed her mother's hand and led them toward the back door. The floodwaters had already started to fill the rooms of the house, and Clara could hear the water rushing outside, louder than ever. They had no choice but to leave the house behind. The family quickly made their way to the barn, hoping to find some shelter there. But the storm was relentless. The rain and wind whipped around them, making it difficult to see anything. Clara stumbled, trying to keep up with her parents as the water reached up to her knees, pulling at her legs with each step. The ground was slick with mud, and the trees that lined the farm swayed dangerously in the storm's fury. By the time they reached the barn, Clara's father was out of breath, his face soaked with rain. He pushed open the door, and the family rushed inside, hoping to find some safety there. Inside, the barn was dimly lit by the faint light of a single lantern. The air smelled of hay and leather, but there was no warmth, only a deep, unsettling cold that seemed to settle in their bones. Clara's mother pulled her close, her arms trembling as she held on to her daughter.
"We'll wait out the storm here," her father said, trying to sound calm despite the growing panic in his voice.
But Clara could see the worry on his face as he glanced toward the door, watching the floodwaters rise higher. Minutes passed like hours, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Clara's stomach churned as she realized how dangerous this storm really was. The floodwaters had already reached the edge of the barn, and there was no telling how much higher they would rise. The rain didn't stop, the wind didn't let up, and Clara's fear grew with every passing moment. As the storm continued to rage outside, Clara tried to stay calm, but the fear in her chest wouldn't go away. Brask. She could hear her parents talking in low voices, trying to figure out what to do next, but Clara couldn't focus on their words. All she could think about was the flood that was sweeping through their farm, threatening to take everything they had worked for. Hours passed, and Clara's family huddled together, trying to keep warm and stay safe. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She had always trusted her parents, but tonight she wasn't so sure. The storm had come out of nowhere, and there was no sign of it slowing down. She looked at her mother, who was sitting on the ground, holding her knees to her chest. Clara could see the worry in her eyes, and for the first time, she realized how truly helpless they were. The flood had taken everything from them. Their crops, their home, and now, it seemed, even their safety. As Clara's father walked to the back of the barn to check on the rising waters, Clara's heart began to race. The fear that had been simmering inside her finally bubbled over. She knew they couldn't stay there forever, but where could they go? The storm had left nothing untouched, and all they could do was wait. She clung to her mother, who whispered comforting words, though Clara could hear the tremor in her voice. Then, as the storm seemed to grow even more fierce, Clara's father returned, his face grim. "There's nothing we can do now," he said. "We need to leave. We have to find higher ground." But Clara wasn't sure if they could make it. She had never seen the floodwaters rise this high before. Her heart pounded as she wondered if they could make it out of this alive. With a heavy heart, Clara's parents gathered their belongings, preparing for the journey ahead. They would have to leave the barn and brave the storm, hoping to find safety somewhere far away. Brit. Clara's small hand clutched her mother's, but in that moment she wasn't sure if they would make it out alive. The storm had come without warning, and now, it seemed, there was no escape. As they stepped out of the barn, Clara couldn't help but glance back at the home they had built, now lost to the flood. Her heart ached, but there was no time to mourn. The flood was rising too quickly. It was now a race against time. Would they make it to safety? Or was the storm going to claim them as well? The storm didn't let up. It was as though the world had turned upside down, and nature itself was unleashing all its fury in a single violent burst. Clara's feet sank into the muddy earth with every step she took, and her heart raced as the floodwaters continued to rise. The noise of the storm, wind howling, rain beating down, and the roar of the rushing water seemed to fill the entire world, leaving no space for anything but the fear that gripped her heart. Clara's mother kept a tight hold on her hand, pulling her along as they struggled to keep moving. Every step seemed more difficult than the last. The rain fell in sheets, drenching them to the bone, and the wind howled in their ears, making it hard to hear anything else. Clara's father led the way, his eyes scanning the horizon as if looking for some sign that help might be near, but the land was empty. The flood had swallowed everything. The farm, the roads, the small house they once called home. All that was left was the endless stretch of water and the violent storm. The barn had seemed like a safe place at first, but now it was only a brief moment of shelter. It was clear that staying there wasn't an option anymore. The water was quickly rising around them, creeping higher with each passing minute, and soon they would be trapped. Clara's father had made the decision to leave, despite the dangers of the storm. There was no choice. The rising water wouldn't wait for them to be ready. As they trudged through the floodwaters, Clara couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. She had never been afraid of storms before. They were a part of life, something to watch from the safety of home. But this storm was different. This was no ordinary rain. The floodwaters were relentless, powerful, and they showed no signs of slowing down. Every step they took felt like a battle, with the water trying to pull them under, the wind pushing them backward. But Clara's parents didn't stop, and neither did she. They had no choice. Clara's father had always been the one to make decisions, the one to lead the family. He was strong, dependable, and always knew what to do. But now there was doubt in his eyes. He looked ahead, squinting through the heavy rain, trying to find any hint of safety. But there was nothing. The world around them was drowned in a sea of water, and all they could do was keep moving forward. "Keep going, Clara," her mother said, her voice calm but strained. Clara could hear the fear in her mother's words, even if she tried to hide it. Clara nodded, though she wasn't sure if she could keep going much longer. The water had reached her waist now, and the strong current was making it harder and harder to move. Bust. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, and the exhaustion was starting to catch up with her. She had never walked this far before in such heavy water. She didn't know how much longer she could keep up the pace. Clara's father stopped for a moment to check the land ahead. He peered through the rain and then looked back at his family. His face was drawn, his brow furrowed with concern. There was no safe place to go, no shelter in sight, just the endless flood. But then something caught his eye, a faint light in the distance. He squinted, trying to make sense of it through the storm. It was small, distant, but it was there. It was a sign of hope. "That way," he said, pointing toward the light. "We'll head toward that light." It might be a house, or a cabin, or something. A disc. A light! There was a chance. A small one, but a chance nonetheless. She looked toward the direction her father was pointing, but all she could see was the blur of rain and the endless sea of water. Yet the light was there, faint but steady, shining through the storm like a beacon. Without hesitation, her father led them toward it. The journey was slow, and each step felt like it took everything out of Clara. The current of the flood seemed to grow stronger, pulling at her, making it harder to keep her footing. But she kept going, keeping her mother's hand tight in hers, following her father's lead. They had to get to that light. As they moved, Clara couldn't help but think about how much had changed in such a short time. Just a few hours ago, she had been sitting in her house playing with her toys and laughing with her parents. Now, everything was different. The flood had stolen everything from them, their home, their belongings, their sense of safety. But they weren't alone. They had each other, and that was something. As long as they stayed together, they could face whatever came next. The storm was relentless. The rain fell harder, and the wind picked up again, howling in their ears. But Clara's father never faltered. He kept moving forward, pushing through the storm with the same determination he had always shown. Clara's mother, too, kept going, her strength never wavering, even though Clara could see the fear in her eyes. Clara was scared, too, but she didn't let it show. She couldn't. She had to be strong for them, just like they were being strong for her. The light seemed to get closer with each step, though it was hard to tell if it was really moving toward them or if they were just getting closer to it. It was a small hope, but it was enough to keep them going. They couldn't stop now. Finally, after what felt like hours of struggling through the floodwaters, they reached the edge of the floodplain. The light grew brighter, and Clara could make out a faint outline of a structure. A house, perhaps, or a small cabin. She could hear the sound of someone shouting over the storm, but the wind was so loud she could barely make it out. It didn't matter. They were close. Clara's father called out, his voice hoarse but strong. "Hello!" "Is anyone there?" The sound of footsteps reached them, followed by a voice. A man's voice, calling out to them through the storm. "Over here! Quickly! Get inside before the flood comes higher!" With renewed energy, Clara's family hurried toward the voice. The man met them halfway, offering his hand to Clara's father, helping him steady himself in the rising waters. "You're lucky I saw the light in time," the man said. "It's been a long time since I've had anyone here, but you've made it just in time. This flood's a bad one. You don't want to be out there much longer." Clara's father nodded, his face grateful. "Thank you. We don't know what we would have done without you." The man led them inside, and the warmth of the cabin enveloped them as they stepped out of the storm. Clara could finally relax for the first time in hours. They were safe for now. As the door closed behind them, Clara felt a sense of relief flood over her. The storm outside raged on, but inside there was warmth, comfort, and a glimmer of hope.
They had made it through the worst of it, and for the first time that night, Clara allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they would be okay.
The storm continued to rage outside the small cabin, but inside, Clara felt a sense of safety she hadn't experienced in hours. The warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth, the smell of dry wood, and the feeling of solid ground beneath her feet made everything feel real again. The terror of the flood, the rush of fear, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness had all been momentarily pushed away by the quiet comfort of the cabin. Clara sat near the fire, her legs tucked beneath her, her clothes still damp but drying quickly in the warmth. Her mother sat beside her, holding her tightly, her face no longer tense with worry but filled with relief. Clara's father had stepped outside briefly to talk to the man who had helped them. He needed to thank him properly and perhaps figure out what to do next. They couldn't stay in the cabin forever, after all. The flood had already washed away their home, and no one knew how much damage had been done to the land. Still, for the moment they were safe, and that was all that mattered. Clara's thoughts drifted back to what had happened. The flood waters had come so suddenly, without warning. Just that morning, everything had seemed normal. They had eaten breakfast together, and Clara had helped her father with a few small chores around the house. It had been a peaceful day, one that promised nothing out of the ordinary. But the storm had changed everything. It had swept through their farm like a force of nature, taking with it everything they had worked for. The crops, the house, even the land itself. It was all gone now, washed away by the violent waters. It was hard for Clara to fully understand what had happened. Brown and desperate. She knew it wasn't just a bad storm. The flood had come so quickly, so forcefully, that no one could have been prepared. Her father had tried to keep them safe, but even he had been caught off guard. Clara had seen the worry in his eyes when he realized how high the water was rising, how fast it was moving. And then there had been the moment when they had to leave the house, the moment when it was clear they had no choice but to run. "Are you okay, sweetie?" Her mother's voice broke through Clara's thoughts, soft and comforting. Desk. Clara looked up at her mother, who was smiling gently, though her eyes still held traces of the fear they had all felt earlier.
Clara nodded, offering a small smile in return.
"I'm fine, Mom, just thinking." Her mother gave her hand a squeeze.
"I know. It's been a long, scary day.
But we're safe now, and we'll figure out what to do tomorrow." Clara nodded again, though part of her didn't quite believe her mother's reassurance. How could they figure things out when everything was gone? How could they rebuild their lives when the world had turned upside down so quickly? But Clara didn't voice her doubts. She knew her mother was trying to comfort her, trying to keep them both calm in the face of everything that had happened. They had always been a family that faced challenges head-on, and her mother's strength was something Clara had always admired. Outside, the storm continued to howl, but inside the cabin it felt quieter. Clara listened to the sound of the fire crackling, the occasional sound of raindrops hitting the roof, and the faint murmur of voices from her father and the man who had helped them. But she could tell that her father was talking seriously now, no longer just exchanging pleasantries. They had to make a plan. They couldn't stay here forever. The floodwaters were still rising, and there was no telling how much longer it would take for the storm to pass. But Clara's mind wandered again. She couldn't help but wonder about the other families in the area. The flood had swept through the entire region. Had anyone else been affected like they had? Were there others who had lost their homes? The thought made her stomach churn. She could only imagine how many other families were out there, stranded and struggling to survive. And for a brief moment, Clara realized just how lucky they had been to find the cabin, to find safety in the middle of all this destruction. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside. Clara looked up, and the door to the cabin creaked open. Her father stepped in, his face still serious but a little less worried than before. "I've spoken with the man," her father said, looking at Clara's mother. "He's offered to help us for the time being. He has a small farm a few miles from here, and he thinks the floodwaters won't reach it. We'll be able to stay there until the storm passes and we can figure out what to do next." Clara felt a surge of relief, a safe place to stay. It wasn't permanent, but it was something. It was a roof over their heads, food to eat, and a chance to recover from the chaos. She looked at her mother, who seemed to relax slightly at the news. "That's good to hear," her mother said softly. "We'll take him up on his offer then." "We need to get somewhere safe and get some rest."
Clara's father nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "We'll head there first thing in the morning."
"The rain's still coming down hard, and we don't want to take any chances tonight. We'll sleep here and get an early start." Breaths. Clara's mother smiled gently, though it didn't reach her eyes fully. "Good idea."
"We'll make it through this, one step at a time." Clara didn't know how long she had been sitting there by the fire, lost in thought. It was hard to grasp the full weight of everything that had happened.
It felt like a bad dream, one that wouldn't end. But as she sat there, the warmth of the fire and the promise of safety for at least one more night gave her something to hold on to. They were alive. They were together. And tomorrow they would take the next step forward. Her father walked over and knelt beside her. "You okay, Clara?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. Clara nodded. Breath. "I'm okay, Dad. Just thinking." "I know, sweetheart." "But we'll be okay. This is just another challenge we have to face. And we've faced a lot of them before, haven't we?" Clara nodded again, this time more firmly. "We'll get through it." Break. Her father stood up and stretched, then glanced at her mother. "We'll start fresh tomorrow. Make a plan. But tonight, we need to rest. We've all been through a lot." Clara's mother agreed, and they all settled down in the small cabin for the night. The wind howled outside, but inside, the warmth of the fire and the safety of being together helped to quiet the noise of the storm. Clara lay down on a small bedroll by the fire, her thoughts still swirling, but her body too tired to stay awake much longer. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to drift into sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new hope. For the first time in hours, Clara felt like they were going to be okay. The morning arrived slowly, as the storm's fury finally began to wane. The heavy rain which had pounded the cabin all night turned into a light drizzle, leaving only the occasional rumble of distant thunder. The wind, too, had softened, no longer howling but gently rustling the trees around the cabin. Inside, Clara awoke to the warmth of the fire, now a little less intense, but still providing comfort and light. Her father had stoked it earlier, and now the cabin smelled of wood and warmth. Blair. Clara stretched and yawned, the events of the previous day slowly coming back to her. It felt strange to wake up to the stillness after the chaos. She had not expected to sleep at all after everything that had happened, but in the end, exhaustion had overtaken her, and sleep had come to her like a quiet gift. She felt the safety of the cabin, but the memory of the floodwaters of the home they had lost still lingered in her mind. She sat up, looking around. Her parents were already awake, speaking in hushed tones by the window. Clara couldn't hear all of their conversation, but she could tell they were discussing their next move. They had spent the night in the cabin, but it was clear they couldn't stay here forever. The flood had taken so much, and they didn't know how long it would take for things to return to normal. It was time to move forward, even if they didn't yet have all the answers. Her mother turned and smiled as Clara stood up. "Good morning, Clara. Did you sleep well?" Clara nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure how much sleep she had gotten. The night had been long, and the storm had kept her on edge, but now that it had passed, she felt more at ease. Her mother handed her a cup of warm tea, and Clara took it gratefully. The warmth of the drink filled her hands and spread through her body, offering comfort and a small sense of peace. Her father, who had been standing by the window, turned toward them, but the water's still high. "We can't wait much longer. We need to get moving. Get to the farm the man told us about." Clara's father had spoken with the man again that morning. He had offered his help for as long as they needed, and Clara's parents had agreed to take him up on it. The man's farm, a few miles away, was higher up, and it seemed like the safest place to go, at least for now. It wasn't the answer to all their problems, but it was a start, a place where they could regroup, find shelter, and begin to think about what came next. "We'll leave soon as we've had a bit of breakfast," her father added. "We need to move quickly, but we also need to make sure we're ready for the journey." Clara's mother nodded and began to prepare a simple meal. Clara helped, though she didn't feel particularly hungry. She was still overwhelmed by the events of the past day, still trying to process everything that had happened. But she knew that her parents needed her to stay strong. They had always been there for her, and now it was her turn to be strong for them. After a quiet breakfast, the family packed up their things, gathering whatever they could carry. The man had offered them supplies, and Clara's parents had accepted gratefully. They packed only the essentials, clothes, a few tools, and some food, but it felt strange to leave their home behind. Everything they had worked for, everything that had been so familiar and comforting, was now gone. The house was lost, the land was flooded, and they had nothing left but what they could carry. Clara felt a lump in her throat as she stood in front of the cabin door, ready to leave. The thought of not returning to the farm, of seeing it submerged in water, felt like a heavy weight on her chest.
But there was no time for grief now.
They had to keep moving. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. The flood was unpredictable, and the waters could rise again. Clara's father gave her a reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. He was worried too. The uncertainty of the future loomed over them all, but there was no choice but to face it. "We'll make it through this," he said, his voice steady, though Clara could hear the quiet worry beneath it. "One step at a time." Clara nodded, trying to believe him. She didn't want to let the fear take hold of her. Despair. She wanted to believe that they would find a way through this, just like they always had in the past. The family stepped outside, the cool morning air feeling fresh after the storm. The sky was a soft gray, and the rain had stopped, leaving the land drenched and muddy. Clara looked around, but all she could see was the devastation. The roads were flooded, and the land that had once been fertile and full of life now lay under several inches of water. The flood had taken so much, but Clara knew that she couldn't focus on the destruction. She had to keep moving forward. They began their journey toward the farm, walking through the mud and water, their feet sinking with each step. The flood waters were still high, but they were beginning to recede in some places. Clara's father led the way, his steps determined, while her mother stayed close to Clara, her hand gently resting on her shoulder. The walk was slow and tiring, but they didn't stop. They couldn't afford to. Every step was a reminder of how much they had lost, but also of how much they still had. They had each other. They were still alive. And for now, that was enough to keep them going. As they walked, Clara tried to keep her mind focused on the future. The farm they were headed to might not be much, but it was a place to start over. It was a safe place for now. She tried not to think about the house they had lost, the crops that had been ruined, or the life that had been swept away. Those things were gone, and all they could do now was survive, rebuild, and move forward.
The man's farm was still a few miles away, but the closer they got, the more Clara could feel a sense of hope returning.
Bang. They were moving towards something, even if it was just a temporary solution. They were moving towards safety. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the man's farm. It was smaller than their own, but it was on higher ground, away from the floodwaters. The man met them at the gate, his face weathered but kind. He welcomed them inside, offering them food and a place to rest. Clara's parents were grateful, but Clara could see the exhaustion in their faces. They had made it through the storm, but they weren't done yet. The man led them to a small barn where they could sleep for the night. It wasn't much, but it was dry, and it was safe. Clara and her family settled in, grateful for the shelter.
As the sun began to set, Clara lay down on the hay, her mind racing with thoughts of the future.
But they had made it this far, but what would come next? Could they rebuild their lives here, or would the flood's destruction be too much to overcome? Clara didn't have the answers, but as she closed her eyes and listened to the quiet of the night, she knew that they would face whatever came next, together. The morning after their arrival at the man's farm was calm, but Clara could sense the weight of uncertainty hanging in the air. The storm had passed, the floodwaters were receding, but the damage was done. Everything had changed. The future was unclear, but for now, they were safe. Reflection. Clara woke early, as she often did, before the rest of her family. She lay in the small barn surrounded by straw and the soft scent of hay, trying to gather her thoughts. The night had been long, and although the shelter was humble, it had offered the comfort of warmth and security. Her parents had slept soundly, exhausted from the journey. But Clara's mind had been too full of thoughts to rest. The events of the past few days replayed over and over in her head. Brash, the flood, the escape, the uncertainty. It all felt surreal. But the signs of destruction outside made it clear. Everything had changed. She pulled herself from the makeshift bed, careful not to wake her mother, who was still asleep beside her. The barn was quiet, save for the occasional creaking of wood as the wind rustled the trees outside. Clara made her way to the door and stepped outside, eager to feel the fresh morning air on her face. The farm was small, with a few fields of dry land and a couple of animals grazing near the barn. The man who had helped them was already up, tending to the animals, his movements methodical and practiced.
"Good morning," Clara called softly, not wanting to startle him. The man looked up from his work and gave her a gentle smile.
"Morning, Clara! How'd you sleep?" he asked, his voice kind but tired, as if he had lived through many difficult days himself. "I slept okay," Clara replied, her gaze drifting over the land. It was hard to imagine how long it would take to rebuild what had been lost.
Thank you again for letting us stay here. The man nodded, his weathered face calm. "You're welcome."
Brett, it's not much, but it's safe. And it's dry. That's all you can ask for right now. Clara didn't know how to respond to that. What could she say? The truth was, they had nothing left but each other.
The farm was barely a step up from the barn they were in, but it was shelter. For now, that had to be enough.
She had to hold on to the fact that they had survived. It was the only thing that mattered.
"Is there anything I can do to help?"
Clara asked, trying to keep her mind busy.
Her father had always taught her to be useful, to never sit idle when there was work to be done.
The man looked at her thoughtfully. "Well, there's always something to do."
"You can help me feed the animals and check the water levels by the creek. The flood might have changed things there."
Clara nodded, eager to feel useful. "I can do that." He handed her a small bucket and showed her where to find the feed for the animals.
Rabbi made her way over to the shed where a few cows and goats were kept. The animals were calm, their eyes soft and kind, but Clara could see how hungry they were.
It had been a rough few days for everyone, animals and people alike. As Clara fed the animals, she couldn't help but notice how different the farm looked now.
The flood had left its mark. The creek that used to run gently alongside the land had swollen into a raging force, tearing away at the banks and leaving debris scattered across the fields. The land was covered in mud, and the once dry paths were now treacherous and unstable. Yet, in a way, the land was resilient. Psst, psst. It had weathered storms before, and it would again. Clara's thoughts were interrupted by her father's voice calling her from the other side of the farm.
"Clara, you up already?"
Clara waved back at him.
"I'm feeding the animals. I'll be right there." Her father walked over, his face more relaxed than it had been the previous day. The storm had passed, and though their future was still uncertain, he seemed to find a small sense of calm in the morning air. "Morning," he said with a soft smile.
How's the farm looking?
Clara shrugged. "It's a mess, but the animals are okay."
"It's strange. I never thought I'd be out here like this. The flood took everything." Her father nodded, his expression thoughtful.
It's hard, I know, but we're still here.
Ration. And as long as we have each other, we'll find a way to rebuild. He paused for a moment, looking out at the land. It won't be easy, but we're survivors. Ration. And that's what matters right now. Ration. Clara looked up at her father, seeing the strength in his eyes. He had always been the rock of their family, the one who could fix anything, the one who could make everything feel right. But she also saw the weariness in him, the exhaustion that came from days of worry and fear. It wasn't easy to stay hopeful when everything around them had been destroyed. But Clara realized that her father wasn't just telling her this for her sake. He needed to hear it too. "Do you think we can rebuild?" Clara asked, her voice uncertain. "Do you think the farm will be okay?" Her father looked at her, his gaze steady and strong.
"Will be, Clara. It will take time, and we'll have to work hard.
But we'll rebuild. We have the land.
We have the animals, and we have each other."
That's more than a lot of people have right now. Her father's words gave her a small spark of hope. It was going to be hard. It was going to take time. But they would rebuild together.
As they finished their work for the morning, Clara and her family gathered around the small kitchen table inside the cabin.
The man had offered them food, a simple meal of eggs and bread, but it was more than enough. They ate in silence for a few moments, the weight of everything still heavy on their shoulders. But there was a sense of quiet understanding between them all. They had each other, and for now, that was enough.
Her father, cleared his throat and looked at her mother. "We need to start making plans."
We can't stay here forever. We'll need to find more help. Maybe some other families who've been affected by the flood.
Together, we can rebuild.
We'll take it one step at a time. For now, we focus on getting back on our feet. Clara listened to their plans, feeling a sense of gratitude toward the man who had taken them in. He had given them a place to stay, but more than that, he had given them hope. He had shown them that even in the face of disaster, there was kindness and community. They weren't alone in this. After breakfast, the family made their way outside again. The sky had cleared, and the sun was starting to peek through the clouds, casting a soft golden light over the land. The storm had passed, but the flood had left its scars. The creek was still swollen, and much of the farmland was covered in mud. But there was hope. The land would heal, just as they would. Slowly they would rebuild. As Clara stood beside her parents, watching the sunrise, she realized that they had made it through the worst of it. They had survived the flood. They had lost so much, but they still had each other. But desperately, and as long as they had that, they could face whatever came next. The road ahead would be long, but they would take it together, one step at a time.